Missouri, 1855. A plantation master forces his 19-year-old enslaved woman into the bedroom of his son, a man who has rejected 12 marriage proposals because no woman meets his impossible standards. By dawn, the young master is dead, his skull shattered, his body cold on the blood-soaked floor. The enslaved woman stands silent, breathing hard, her massive hands trembling. Was this self-defense against sexual violence or premeditated murder planned in the shadows of bondage? What appears to be a simple case of violent resistance reveals something far more disturbing: a systematic pattern of sexual enslavement, eugenic obsession, and a father's calculated attempt to breed the perfect heir. The truth buried in those Missouri court records will make your blood run cold. Before we continue, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit the like button. Picture Missouri in 1855. Not the Deep South, but a border state where slavery existed in a peculiar, unsettled form, close enough to free states that enslaved people could sometimes taste freedom on the wind, yet still bound by chains both literal and legal. The Missouri Compromise had torn the state apart politically. Pro-slavery and abolitionist factions clashed violently in neighboring Kansas. Blood literally soaked the border territories. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't the plantation south of popular imagination with endless cotton fields. Missouri slaveholders often owned smaller numbers of enslaved people, working alongside them in hemp production, tobacco farming, and household labor. This proximity created a different kind of horror: intimate, personal, inescapable. Masters knew their captives by name, knew their families, their habits, their fears. This familiarity didn't breed compassion. It bred a more insidious kind of control. The Benton plantation sat in Howard County, where the Missouri River curved like a scar through fertile bottomland. Fog rolled off the water on autumn mornings. The smell of wood smoke and river mud hung perpetually in the air. And in the big house, a family conspiracy was unfolding that would end in bloodshed. Robert Newsom presented himself as a model Christian gentleman. 56 years old, prosperous, respected in the community. He owned a successful farm, attended church every Sunday, and was known for his fair treatment of his enslaved workers, whatever that grotesque euphemism meant in a system built entirely on violence. His neighbors considered him reasonable, even enlightened for his time. His son, Robert Newsom Jr., was something else entirely. At 25, he'd become the talk of Howard County for all the wrong reasons. 12 young women from respectable families had been paraded before him as potential brides. 12 times he'd found fault. Too plain, too loud, too educated, too submissive, too assertive, too poor, too grasping. His standards, his father confided to friends, were impossibly high. But here's what nobody said aloud at those church socials. Young Robert had a specific obsession. He wanted a woman who was physically imposing, powerful, capable of bearing him strong children. He spoke of it obliquely, using the language of animal husbandry that plantation culture normalized. He wanted to breed strength into his lineage, and his father, Robert Sr., was listening carefully to every word his son said. He was listening, and he was planning. Let's be real, the Newsoms needed a story that would satisfy the community's questions. Why was young Robert still unmarried? The official explanation painted him as merely selective, a perfectionist waiting for true love. His father told neighbors that his son was modern in his thinking and wouldn't settle for conventional matches. Some people nodded approvingly. How refreshing, they said, that a young man of means would wait for genuine affection, rather than pursuing a mercenary marriage. The family presented young Robert as bookish, scholarly, more interested in agricultural innovation than society balls. They said he was developing new crop rotation techniques, studying soil composition, reading treatises on scientific farming. All of this was partially true, which made it the perfect lie. Yes, he read voraciously, but his reading material included pseudoscientific texts about heredity, physical characteristics, and racial theories that were gaining popularity among plantation owners seeking to justify their system. When Robert Sr. purchased Celia in June 1855, he told his neighbors it was a practical investment. He needed someone strong for heavy household work. His wife's health was failing, and the farm required additional labor. Nobody questioned this. Nobody asked why he paid premium prices for a specific type of enslaved woman. The transaction seemed unremarkable in a society built on such transactions. Paragraph 7. The sinister infrastructure. 200 words. Now you have to understand how the system enabled this horror. Missouri law in 1855 explicitly stated that enslaved people were property with no legal right to refuse their master's commands. Any commands. Sexual assault of enslaved women wasn't legally recognized as a crime because you couldn't rape your own property. This wasn't a loophole. This was the designed architecture of the system. The Newsom property included a small cabin specifically designated for Celia, separated from the other enslaved workers' quarters. Robert Sr. had it built shortly after purchasing her, positioning it between the main house and the other outbuildings. Close enough for immediate access, isolated enough for screams to go unheard or deliberately ignored. The cabin had a single door with no lock on the inside. The window was small, positioned high. Every architectural choice was a strategic decision about control. County records show that Robert Sr. held the title of magistrate. He literally helped enforce local laws. His brother served as county sheriff. His cousin was a circuit court judge. The Newsom family formed part of the judicial infrastructure of Howard County. If Celia had somehow found the impossible courage to report sexual assault, she would have been reporting it to the Newsom family's legal network. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. When neighbors occasionally noticed Celia's withdrawn demeanor, her visible exhaustion, the way she sometimes moved as though her body caused her pain, the explanations came easily. She was adjusting to her new situation. Perfectly normal for recently purchased slaves, people said. She was naturally melancholic. Some people just had that temperament. She was working hard because Robert Sr. was preparing his farm for winter. If anyone noticed Robert Sr. visiting Celia's cabin at odd hours, well, masters frequently checked on their property, ensuring everything was in order. Nothing unusual about that. And if some of the other enslaved workers whispered among themselves, their testimony didn't matter. They couldn't testify in court against white people. Their observations, their knowledge, their witness to what was happening carried no legal weight whatsoever. I want you to picture this. A community that functioned by collectively agreeing not to see what was plainly visible. Celia was purchased in June. By July, she was visibly pregnant. By August, the other enslaved workers on the property knew exactly what was happening. By September, Celia had been forced into sexual servitude for months, and the entire structure of society, legal, social, religious, bent itself into shapes that made this invisible. The oddities weren't explained away. They were deliberately rendered invisible through practiced blindness. Robert Newsom's daughters, Virginia and Mary, lived in the main house. They were grown women, married, but frequently visited their father's property with their own children. They saw Celia daily. They gave her household tasks. They watched their father's nighttime walks to her cabin, and they said nothing. Their silence wasn't passive. It was active participation in their father's crimes. The enslaved workers on the property, George, a man in his 30s and others whose names are lost to history, they knew everything. George later testified that everyone understood what was happening to Celia. But what could they do? Intervening meant death. Speaking out meant punishment not just for themselves but for their families. The system created witnesses who were simultaneously powerless and culpable through their enforced silence. Then there was young Robert himself. For months he watched his father's abuse of Celia. He knew she was pregnant with his father's child, and when his father proposed giving Celia to him as a wife, not in any legal sense but as his own sexual property, young Robert didn't object on moral grounds. His only concern was whether she met his physical specifications. He examined her as one might examine livestock. The collaboration wasn't about active participation in every crime. It was about the infrastructure of silence and complicity that made the crimes possible. Celia was 19 years old. Let that sink in. 19. Think about who you were at 19, what you dreamed about, what you feared. Now imagine being purchased, owned, with every legal protection stripped away. She was described in the sale records as a Negro woman, tall and stout, of good health and strong constitution. That clinical language masked a human being, a person with thoughts, fears, hopes, a personality, a history we can barely glimpse through the legal documents that would later define her life. Before the Newsom purchase, Celia had lived with a different enslaver in nearby Audrain County. We know almost nothing about her early life. Slavery obliterated personal histories. We don't know if she had siblings, parents, children from before. The paper trail begins with her sale. $100 changed hands. A human being's ownership transferred, and everything that made her who she was became legally irrelevant. But here's what we do know from court testimony. Celia had formed a relationship with George, the enslaved man on the Newsom property. They loved each other. They planned impossibly to build some form of family within the constraints of bondage. When Robert Sr. began his assaults, George pleaded with her to resist somehow. Love existed even in hell. That's the part the legal documents can't erase. Virginia Newsom Wainscott didn't intend to become a witness to murder. She was her father's eldest daughter, visiting the family farm in late June 1855, her own children in tow. The afternoon was humid, oppressive, the kind of Missouri heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin. She was walking from the main house to the kitchen building when she heard raised voices from Celia's cabin, her father's voice commanding. Celia's voice, which Virginia had only ever heard as quiet, submissive, suddenly rising in something between plea and refusal. Virginia slowed her walk but didn't stop. What she heard next, her father's insistence that Celia would now belong to her brother Robert, that this had all been arranged, that resistance was futile, should have shocked her. It didn't, or if it did, she hid it well. This is where the story gets truly chilling. Virginia went about her day. She said nothing to her father, nothing to her brother, nothing to anyone. But she'd heard the terms of the arrangement. She understood that her father was handing Celia to her brother as sexual property, a gift-wrapped human being. And when everything exploded into violence weeks later, Virginia would be the one witness who could have prevented it all, but chose silence instead. Her testimony would later reveal she knew everything and intervened in nothing. Now, you have to understand what happened in the weeks between that conversation and the night of the killing. Virginia watched the arrangement unfold. Young Robert began making visits to Celia's cabin. Celia's demeanor changed visibly. The other enslaved workers later testified she seemed troubled, frightened, that she stopped eating properly. She was pregnant with Robert Sr.'s child, and now his son was being granted access to her. The psychological torture of this situation is almost incomprehensible. George, her partner, confronted her. Court records preserve fragments of their conversation. He told her he couldn't continue their relationship if she was going to submit to young Robert. The cruelty of this statement, blaming the victim for her own sexual enslavement, reveals how deeply the violence of slavery infected every relationship, even those built on love. George was traumatized, powerless, and he displaced his rage onto the only person who had less power than he did. Celia did something remarkable. She attempted to negotiate her own freedom from sexual assault. She went to Virginia, her master's daughter, and begged for intervention. She asked Virginia to speak to young Robert, to make him leave her alone. I want you to picture this moment. An enslaved woman, owned as property, attempting to use the only avenue available to her, appealing to another woman's sense of decency. Virginia refused to help. She told Celia to handle it herself. When Celia realized no one would intervene, she made a desperate decision. She confronted young Robert directly when he came to her cabin on the evening of June 23, 1855. She told him, and this is documented in her later testimony, that she was sick, pregnant, exhausted, and that he had to stop. She begged him to leave her alone, at least until after she gave birth. Young Robert laughed at her, laughed. He told her she had no right to refuse him. His father had given her to him as property, and property doesn't say no. What young Robert didn't understand, couldn't understand through the fog of his entitlement, was that he'd pushed a desperate person past the point of caring about consequences. Celia had realized that death might actually be preferable to continued rape. That calculation, choosing between certain ongoing torture and possible death, is where the institution of slavery drove people. To a place where murder seemed like the only rational choice. Celia picked up a stick, a thick piece of hickory firewood that sat by her cabin's small fireplace. When Robert reached for her, she swung it at his head with all the strength that had made her valuable as property. The first blow stunned him. The second crushed his skull. He fell, bleeding, dying on the floor of her cabin. And Celia stood there, breathing hard, realizing what she'd just done. The Celia who stood trial in October 1855 was unrecognizable from the woman purchased 4 months earlier. Witnesses described her as hollow-eyed, skeletal, despite being visibly pregnant. She'd lost her child, whether through miscarriage brought on by stress or something more deliberately induced by desperation. The records don't clarify. The trauma had physically transformed her body. George, who'd ultimately helped her dispose of young Robert's body in the fireplace, exhibited what we'd now recognize as symptoms of severe PTSD. He was questioned repeatedly by authorities, and each interrogation left him shaking, unable to eat. His testimony was confused, contradictory, clearly the words of someone whose mind was fragmenting under impossible pressure. But the most altered victim was arguably Virginia. Her testimony during the trial revealed a woman who'd witnessed her own father's sexual abuse of an enslaved teenager, said nothing, then watched her brother continue that abuse, and still said nothing. She'd become so normalized to violence that she could describe Celia's desperate pleas for help with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. The system had successfully transformed a woman who might once have felt compassion into a person who could watch rape unfold and call it property management. The visible evidence wasn't just on Celia's traumatized body, it was in the moral vacancy behind Virginia's eyes. During the trial, something disturbing emerged from the testimony and evidence. Robert Sr. had kept journals, farm management records that included notes about his enslaved workers' physical characteristics, health, and breeding potential. Yes, breeding. He wrote about human beings the way one might document livestock bloodlines. Celia was described in his ledger as having excellent constitution for childbearing, strong back, good teeth, likely to produce robust offspring. Young Robert had inherited this pseudoscientific obsession. His rejection of 12 potential brides wasn't mere pickiness. He'd been evaluating them against criteria derived from the same racist eugenic theories his father had absorbed. He wanted specific physical traits, specific measurements. The brides had been too small, too delicate, too refined. He wanted, quite literally, to breed human beings for strength and size, exactly as his father had done through the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. The methodology was laid bare in court. Purchase enslaved women with specific physical characteristics, force pregnancy upon them, evaluate the children for desired traits, repeat the process. This wasn't spontaneous violence. This was calculated, systematic, theoretically justified through the era's scientific racism. The Newsomes had turned human reproduction into a breeding program, and young Robert had died, trying to continue his father's eugenic experiment. The calculated nature of this horror, its systematic, documented, theorized quality, makes it infinitely more disturbing than simple spontaneous violence. This is where John Jameson enters our story. He wasn't a typical hero, no white knight riding to rescue anyone. Jameson was a defense attorney from Columbia, Missouri, who'd built a career on unpopular cases. He defended criminals everyone else considered indefensible. He'd represented accused murderers, thieves, con men. His reputation was controversial. Some people considered him a mercenary who'd defend anyone for money. Others saw him as a man genuinely committed to the principle that everyone deserved legal representation. When Jameson took Celia's case in August 1855, he wasn't motivated by abolitionist fervor. His personal letters reveal someone more complex and flawed than that. He believed slavery was economically inefficient and morally questionable, but he wasn't actively working to abolish it. He owned household servants himself, the terminology he used, but let's be honest about what that meant. So why take a case he knew was unwinnable? The answer seems to be professional pride, mixed with genuine outrage at the specifics of Celia's situation. Jameson had daughters. The idea of sexual slavery, of forced rape leading to such desperation that murder became rational, it triggered something in him. His legal notebooks from the period show a man wrestling with contradictions, defending an institution he benefited from, while recognizing its absolute moral bankruptcy. Flawed, yes, but determined to force the legal system to confront its own contradictions. Jameson's investigation strategy was brilliant and doomed simultaneously. He knew Missouri law didn't recognize enslaved people, as having the right to self-defense against their masters. But there was a tiny legal ambiguity. Some scholars argued that natural law, the philosophical foundation undergirding American legal theory, recognized universal rights to bodily integrity. Jameson decided to force Missouri courts to clarify whether an enslaved woman had any legal right to resist rape. He interviewed everyone connected to the case: George, the other enslaved workers, the Newsom daughters, neighbors. He documented the systematic nature of Robert Sr.'s abuse. He gathered evidence of young Robert's explicit statements about ownership and property rights. He built a case file that read like an indictment of the entire institution of slavery. Jameson visited Celia in the county jail repeatedly. She was housed in a small cell, monitored constantly, denied even basic privacy. During these conversations, Celia revealed the full scope of what had been done to her. The pregnancy from Robert Sr.'s rapes, the miscarriage or abortion that had followed, young Robert's insistence that she belonged to him now, her desperate plea to Virginia for help, the moment when young Robert had laughed at her request to be left alone. The stick, the blood, the panic. Jameson realized he was documenting something larger than one woman's trial. He was exposing the logical endpoint of a system built on absolute ownership of human beings. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. We're about to enter the courtroom where the entire moral foundation of American slavery would be quietly tested and, ultimately, affirmed through Celia's conviction. What you're going to hear isn't just about one woman's tragic story. It's about how legal systems contort themselves to protect power while wearing the mask of justice. Need you to stay with me through this next section. It's not easy. The trial transcripts are infuriating, heartbreaking, and revelatory all at once. If you're finding this valuable, if you want to understand how historical injustice actually functioned in practical legal terms, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me what you're thinking at this point in the story. And if you can, consider becoming a channel member. It directly supports this kind of deep dive investigative content. Let's continue. October 1855. The trial began in Callaway County Courthouse, a building that still stands today. Jameson presented his defense with meticulous care. He introduced evidence of Robert Sr.'s systematic sexual abuse of Celia, documented through testimony from Virginia and the enslaved workers. He established that young Robert had explicitly claimed ownership rights over Celia's body. He proved that Celia had attempted every possible avenue to escape her situation before resorting to violence. Then came the bombshell evidence. Jameson requested that the court instruct the jury to consider whether an enslaved woman had the right to use deadly force to prevent rape. He cited Missouri's own statutes on self-defense, arguing they made no racial exceptions. If a white woman could legally kill a man attempting to rape her, how could the law deny that same right to an enslaved woman? The prosecution's response revealed everything. They argued that Missouri's self-defense statutes applied only to people recognized as full persons under law. Enslaved individuals were property. Property cannot exercise self-defense against its owner. Young Robert, as his father's son and heir, had ownership rights to Celia. Therefore, she had murdered someone who legally possessed her. I want you to picture the courtroom in this moment. Jameson had forced them to say the quiet part loud. The system had to explicitly articulate that human beings could be raped with impunity if they were enslaved. The truth was undeniable now. Between the defense's closing arguments and the jury's deliberation, something extraordinary happened. On the night of October 11th, someone helped Celia escape from the county jail. The identity of this person was never definitively established, though suspicion fell on several sources. Possibly one of Jameson's assistants, possibly sympathetic jailers, possibly members of Missouri's small underground railroad network. Celia disappeared into the October darkness. For 3 days she was missing. Possessions were formed. Slave catchers combed the countryside. The Missouri River was watched at every crossing point. Notices appeared in newspapers offering rewards for her capture. Negro woman, 19 years old, tall and stout, likely in desperate condition, wanted for the murder of Robert Newsom Jr. The pursuit was frenzied because Celia's escape threatened the entire social order. If an enslaved woman who'd killed her rapist could escape punishment, what message did that send? The hunt intensified. Dogs were brought in. Every creek crossing, every abandoned barn, every sympathetic household known to harbor abolitionist sentiments was searched. They found her on October 14th, hiding in the woods near Jefferson City, 50 miles from the courthouse. She was starving, sick, barely able to walk. The brief taste of freedom had ended. She was returned to jail, this time with guards posted around the clock. The escape attempt had been doomed from the start, but desperation had demanded she try. When the trial resumed, Jameson presented his final argument. He spoke for 3 hours, and witnesses said grown men wept in the courtroom. He detailed every instance of Robert Sr.'s sexual violence against Celia. He described young Robert's entitled insistence on his ownership rights. He walked the jury through Celia's desperate attempts to seek help from Virginia, from other enslaved workers, from anyone who might intervene. Then he made his moral argument. Gentlemen of the jury, you must decide today what kind of society Missouri will be. Will we acknowledge that all human beings, regardless of their status, possess an inalienable right to protect their bodies from violation? Or will we declare that the color of a person's skin and the circumstances of their birth places them outside the protection of even the most basic human decency? The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. No recommendation for mercy. Judge William Hall, presiding, sentenced Celia to death by hanging. Let's be real, the outcome was never in doubt. Missouri in 1855 couldn't afford to rule that enslaved people could kill their masters in self-defense. The entire economic and social structure of the state rested on absolute property rights. Jameson had proven his case morally, but lost it legally. The law had worked exactly as designed. After the verdict, authorities conducted a thorough investigation of the Newsom property. What they found corroborated everything Jameson had argued. Celia's cabin contained bloodstains that had been incompletely scrubbed away. The fireplace held bone fragments, the remnants of young Robert's body, which Celia and George had burned in desperate panic after the killing. The ashes told a story of absolute desperation. But more disturbing were the findings in Robert Sr.'s study in the main house. His journals contained years of documented sexual abuse. He'd kept records of which enslaved women he'd impregnated, which children had resulted, which of those children exhibited his desired physical characteristics. One journal entry, dated 3 weeks before he purchased Celia, read, "Must acquire new stock for household." Robert shows interest in pursuing father's agricultural experiments. Strong constitution essential for breeding program. The farm ledgers revealed purchases of multiple enslaved women over the years, each selected for specific physical traits. Several had been sold after bearing children. The systematic nature of the abuse was documented in Robert Sr.'s own handwriting. He'd created a breeding program for human beings and documented it with the casual precision of a farmer, tracking livestock bloodlines. The Chamber of Horrors wasn't a physical space. It was the accumulated paper trail of calculated, theorized, systematized sexual violence spread across years. Robert Newsom Sr.'s past revealed even darker secrets. Court investigators discovered he'd been accused twice before of sexual assault, once in Kentucky in 1832, once in Missouri in 1847. Both times, the accusations had been quietly settled without trial. The first involved an enslaved teenager he'd owned briefly before selling her to a plantation in Alabama. The second involved a neighbor's daughter who'd later withdrawn her accusation after her family received a mysterious financial payment. Young Robert's personal papers contained correspondence with other plantation owners' sons, discussing breeding theories and the mongrel problem, racist pseudoscience, about maintaining pure bloodlines while simultaneously exploiting enslaved women. He'd been part of an informal network of men obsessed with eugenic theories, sharing ideas about selective breeding of enslaved populations to produce stronger workers. The Newsom daughters' complicity went deeper than passive witnessing. Virginia's diary, discovered during the property investigation, contained entries acknowledging her father's nighttime visits to Celia's cabin. She'd written, "Father's appetites are an embarrassment, but one mustn't interfere in a man's management of his property." Mary, the younger daughter, had actively prevented other enslaved workers from helping Celia. warning them they'd be sold south if they interfered. The villainy wasn't confined to the two Roberts. It was a family system of abuse, enabled and protected by everyone who benefited from it. As investigators dug deeper, connections emerged to a broader network of systematic sexual exploitation, masquerading as plantation management. Robert Sr. had corresponded with plantation owners across Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas, discussing breeding stock and improvement of agricultural labor through selective propagation. These letters revealed an informal network of enslavers who'd fully embraced eugenic theories, treating human beings as breeding experiments. One particularly disturbing connection led to a plantation in Louisiana run by a man named James Richards, who developed what he called scientific protocols for Negro improvement. Richards and Robert Sr. had exchanged letters discussing the ideal physical measurements for enslaved women intended for reproductive purposes. They'd shared success stories of children born from forced sexual encounters who exhibited desired traits of strength and endurance. The network extended internationally. Richards had imported several of his theories from Caribbean plantation owners who'd been practicing systematic rape-based breeding programs for decades. British abolitionists had documented similar practices in Jamaica and Barbados, where plantation owners kept meticulous records of forced breeding programs designed to create enslaved populations suited for specific types of The Newsom case wasn't an isolated instance of individual depravity. It was a note in an international system of sexual violence theoretically justified by pseudoscience and economically motivated by the desire to create self-reproducing enslaved labor forces without relying on the now illegal international slave trade. Now, you have to understand how Howard County reacted to these revelations. Despite overwhelming evidence of systematic sexual abuse, the community closed ranks around the Newsoms' reputation. Local newspapers reported the trial with headlines like, "Negro Woman Murders Her Master's Son," with no mention of the sexual violence that precipitated the killing. Robert Sr. was described in obituaries as a respected farmer and Christian gentleman taken from us by cruel fate. The conspiracy of silence operated at every level. Ministers preached sermons about the dangers of unruly servants and the importance of maintaining discipline. The business community worried that sympathetic treatment of Celia's case would encourage slave rebellions. Politicians pointed to the Newsom case as evidence that abolitionist ideas were dangerous. Look what happens when enslaved people get notions about rights and resistance. Even potential allies in the anti-slavery movement largely abandoned Celia. Missouri's small abolitionist community was divided. Some argued that defending a murderess, even one with justifiable cause, would damage their broader political goals. The murder weapon, deadly violence rather than moral persuasion, made her an inconvenient symbol. She'd transgressed the boundaries of acceptable resistance by killing a white man, which made her radioactive even to people who opposed slavery. The silence was strategic, comprehensive, and remarkably effective. Within 2 years, most Howard County residents would claim to barely remember the case. Celia was executed by hanging on December 21, 1855, in a field outside the Callaway County Courthouse. Witnesses reported she remained silent during the execution, offering no final words. She was 19 years old. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave, location unknown. Enslaved people weren't granted marked graves, even in death. They were denied recognition as individuals worthy of remembrance. George, who'd helped dispose of young Robert's body, was sold to a plantation owner in Arkansas immediately after the trial. His fate is unknown. Court records show he was sold for $800, a relatively low price, suggesting his complicity in the murder had damaged his market value. Robert Newsom Sr. lived another 18 months after his son's death. He never publicly acknowledged his sexual abuse of Celia. He died in April 1857, of natural causes, and was buried in the Howard County Cemetery with a headstone identifying him as a devoted father and faithful Christian. The gravestone still stands. Virginia and Mary, the Newsom daughters, inherited their father's property, including the remaining enslaved workers. Neither ever spoke publicly about the case again. Virginia's later diary entries, preserved by her descendants, never mention Celia or the trial. The conspiracy of silence extended into their personal records. John Jameson continued, practicing law until his death in 1869, he never took another case involving enslaved defendants. Celia's case exposed the central contradiction of American slavery that the nation would go to war over 6 years later. You cannot simultaneously treat people as property and as moral agents responsible for their actions. If Celia was property, she couldn't commit murder any more than a knife can commit murder. If she could commit murder, she possessed moral agency and therefore the right to self-defense. Missouri law tried to have it both ways, treating enslaved people as property for all purposes except criminal liability for actions against their oppressors. The case revealed how sexual violence against enslaved women functioned as foundational to the entire system. This wasn't incidental abuse by particularly depraved individuals. It was systematic, theorized, economically motivated, and legally protected. The children born from these rapes became property, increasing their enslavers' wealth. The silence surrounding this violence was enforced by law, social convention, and economic interest. The legacy we've inherited from cases like Celia's is a national unwillingness to fully confront the sexual violence central to American slavery. We teach sanitized versions focusing on labor exploitation while minimizing the systematic rape that created generations of enslaved people. We discuss slavery's economic dimensions while downplaying the eugenic experiments plantation owners conducted on human bodies. Celia's story demands we face this history directly, in all its disturbing detail. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. How many Celias were there? How many enslaved women killed their rapists and left no historical record? How many cases like the Newsom's breeding program happened quietly, documented only in plantation ledgers destroyed before they could bear witness? The archive is full of absences, stories deliberately erased, names never recorded, testimonies never heard because the legal system denied their very possibility. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? Systems of exploitation adapt. They don't announce themselves with slavery's explicit brutality.